That pathetic woman sitting at table 1. Chloe Carter's voice cut through the grand ballroom like a blade. She's already been replaced. She seized the microphone, shoved the MC aside, and turned to face 600 frozen guests. Her finger stabbed the air directly toward Victoria Hayes. Daniel hasn't loved her in years. He loves me. He chose me. And I am done pretending otherwise in front of people who already know the truth. She snatched Victoria's own champagne glass off the table and raised it high. Toast to the new Mrs. Hayes, because that tired, forgotten woman, her chapter is finished. Victoria did not blink. She already knew who was coming. If you are watching this right now, please subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will stay with you. Drop a comment and tell me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The evening had started the way all these evenings started, with too much perfume in the elevator, too many air kisses at the entrance, and the particular kind of tension that only exists in rooms where money and ego share the same oxygen. Victoria had dressed carefully, not because she wanted to impress anyone, not because she still cared what Daniel thought when he looked at her. She dressed carefully because she had learned, over 22 years of attending events like this one, that the way you walked into a room told people everything about what you expected to happen inside it. And tonight, Victoria Whitmore Hayes expected quite a lot to happen. She had known about Chloe Carter for 6 months, not suspected. Known. There is a difference, and that difference matters more than most people realize. Suspicion makes you anxious. Knowledge makes you patient. Victoria had moved through the last 6 months in a state of extraordinary patience, the kind that other people sometimes mistake for weakness, or for obliviousness, or for the quiet resignation of a woman who has simply given up. None of those people knew Victoria well. None of them understood what she was doing. She was waiting. The grand ballroom of the Hartwell Hotel occupied the entire east wing of the building's 42nd floor. On a clear night, and this was a clear night, you could see the George Washington Bridge from the far windows, its lights strung like a necklace against the dark water. The annual Meridian Foundation Gala had been held here for 11 consecutive years, and in those 11 years it had raised over $200 million for childhood literacy programs across 12 states. It was by any measure a serious event attended by serious people. Daniel Hayes was one of the evening's primary sponsors. His company, Hayes Dynamics, had contributed $4 million to the foundation that year, which was precisely why he had been given a prominent table near the front and a speaking slot during the second half of the program. Victoria had helped plan his remarks. She had sat across from him at the kitchen table 3 weeks ago with her reading glasses on, a glass of sparkling water beside her, going through his speech line by line and suggesting where the pauses should fall, where the humor could land, where he needed to sound less like a press release and more like a human being. He had kissed her on the cheek when they were done and told her she was invaluable. She had smiled and said nothing, because she already knew. Because by that point she had been carrying the knowledge for 4 months, and she had gotten very good at the weight of it. The first real sign had not been the phone. Everyone always said it was the phone, the hidden screen, the face-down placement on the kitchen counter, the sudden habit of sleeping with the device under the pillow. Those things came later. The first real sign had been something much smaller and much more damning. Daniel had stopped his asking her opinion. For 17 years of their marriage, Daniel had asked Victoria's opinion about everything. About the company's expansion strategy, about whether to hire a particular executive, about which charity causes deserved their support, which social invitations to accept, which journalists to trust with background access. He valued her judgment the way some men value a compass, not because it told him what he wanted to hear, but because it was consistently, reliably accurate. And then, sometime in early spring, he stopped. At first she thought he was distracted. Then she thought he was stressed. Then she thought, and this was the thought that shifted everything she thought, he is getting someone else's opinion now. He found someone who tells him yes, and she began very quietly to pay attention in a different way. Victoria did not hire a private investigator. She did not go through his phone. She did not confide in her friends because she was not ready to make the situation real to anyone outside her own mind. What she did instead was observe. She listened to the silences in his phone conversations when she walked past. She noticed how he cleared his browser history, not the casual, occasional clearing of a private man but the obsessive, almost daily clearing of someone with something specific to hide. She noticed that he had started going to the gym at 7 in the morning, when for 11 years he had gone at 6, and that this 45-minute shift aligned perfectly with the arrival time of a particular senior manager at Hayes Dynamics who worked in the strategy division and whose name Victoria had heard only in passing until she began to hear it all the time. Chloe Carter, 29 years old, Stanford, MBA, hired 18 months ago on the strength of a recommendation from one of Daniel's board members. By all professional accounts, brilliant, ambitious, magnetic in a meeting room. Victoria had met her at the Hayes Dynamics holiday party 7 months ago and had thought she is very young. And then, immediately after that thought, she had thought, Daniel is looking at her the way he used to look at me. She had gone home that night and sat in the dark in her reading chair for 2 hours. Not crying, thinking. The night of the gala arrived on a Thursday in late October. The leaves in Central Park had gone gold and copper, and the air had that particular autumn sharpness that New Yorkers spend all year waiting for. Victoria had her hair done at 3 in the afternoon. Her gown, midnight blue silk with a fitted bodice and a skirt that moved when she walked, had been chosen 3 weeks earlier, and had been hanging in the guest bedroom closet ever since. She put on her mother's diamond earrings, the ones Eleanor Whitmore had worn to her own wedding in 1971, and she looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. She looked like a woman who was absolutely in control of everything. She was not. But she had learned, a very long time ago, that looking like something and being something were not always the same thing, and that sometimes the looking was the more important of the two. Daniel met her in the lobby. He wore a black tuxedo, and the cufflinks she had given him. For their 15th anniversary, she noticed them and felt something move through her that she refused to name. He told her she looked beautiful. He said it the way you say things when you are performing the correct behavior, checking the box, demonstrating to no one in particular that everything is fine. Thank you, she said. You look very well. They rode to the hotel in silence that they both disguised as contentment. The ballroom, when they arrived, was already half full. The foundation's executive director, a woman named Marianne Cole, intercepted them near the entrance and spent 10 minutes telling Daniel how grateful the foundation was for his support and telling Victoria how wonderful she looked. Victoria thanked her warmly and meant it. She liked Marianne. She respected her work. They were seated at table 1 nearest the stage. Daniel's name card was at the seat closest to the podium stairs because he would be getting up to speak later. Victoria's was beside his. On her other side was Henry Cass, a 70-year-old financier, who had known her father for 40 years and who greeted her with genuine affection and a firm handshake. Your father tells me you've been working with the Whitmore Foundation on the Arts Initiative, Henry said, as a waiter placed a glass of champagne in front of him. We broke ground on the Community Arts Center in Newark last month, Victoria said. 12,000 square feet. Free programming for anyone under 18. Augustus must be proud. He didn't stop smiling for 3 days. Henry laughed. That sounds exactly like him. And for the first 45 minutes of the evening, it was precisely this conversation, champagne, the careful social machinery of an event that existed to do genuine good in the world. Victoria moved through it with the ease of a woman who had been doing this for 2 decades. She was warm without being performative. She asked questions and listened to the answers. She laughed at the right moments and was serious at the right moments and left every person she spoke with feeling, in some undefinable way, better than they had before she approached them. She was also watching the room. She spotted Chloe Carter at 7:43. Chloe had arrived in a red gown, not quite the right red. Victoria noted automatically, too warm for her skin tone, though she was beautiful enough that it almost didn't matter. She was with a group of Hayes Dynamics executives, mid-level strategists and their spouses, and she was laughing at something one of them had said, with the particular animation of someone who is very aware of being watched. She had a way of filling the space around her, a kind of physical confidence that read, from a distance, as self-assurance, and read, up close, as hunger. Daniel saw her too. Victoria watched him see her without looking like she was watching him see anything. He tensed, just slightly, the way a man tenses when something is about to become much more complicated than he planned. That tension told Victoria everything she needed to know about what Chloe Carter intended to do tonight. She reached for her champagne and took a sip and thought, all right, let's see how this goes. The program began at 8. The Foundation's chair gave opening remarks. A video played about a 10-year-old girl in rural Mississippi who had learned to read through one of the Foundation's programs and was now, at 16, the editor of her school newspaper. Several people at Table 1 dabbed their eyes. Daniel gave a brief, warm applause. Victoria applauded also and meant it. Then Daniel was called to the stage for his remarks, and he walked up with the ease of a man who is entirely comfortable in front of crowds, which had always been one of the genuinely attractive things about him, and he adjusted the microphone and looked out at the room. He did not look at his wife. He looked, for just a moment, toward the cluster of Hayes Dynamics tables near the center of the room. Toward Chloe. Victoria saw him do it. She kept her expression perfectly calm and thought, there it is. Daniel's speech was good. She had made it good. He spoke about the responsibility of success, about building things that lasted, about the fact that a company's character was ultimately measured not by its quarterly reports, but by what it chose to put back into the world. He got genuine applause. He thanked the Foundation. He thanked his table. And he said, and this was a line Victoria had not written, a line she heard for the first time at this moment, standing in front of 600 people, he said, I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about new chapters, about the courage it takes to follow your heart into uncertain territory. And I think the Foundation's work embodies that courage. The willingness to begin again. New chapters, follow your heart. Begin again. Victoria felt the words land like flat stones on still water. She understood immediately and with perfect clarity exactly what was happening. This was not a speech anymore. This was an announcement. She looked at her champagne glass. She picked it up. She set it back down without drinking. Around her, people were still applauding, still smiling, completely unaware that the words they had just applauded were the verbal equivalent of a man standing in the middle of his own home, setting it on fire. Daniel came back to the table. Henry Castellan said wonderful remarks. One of the other guests said very moving. Daniel smiled and thanked them and did not look at Victoria once. Victoria said very quietly, that was some speech. He finally looked at her, and something in his face, a flicker of something she could not fully identify. Guilt or defiance or relief, or possibly all three at once, told her that he understood what she meant. Thank you, he said, and then they went back to not looking at each other. 40 minutes passed. Dessert was served. The program resumed with an auction, a painting, a vacation package, a private dinner with a celebrated chef, and the room grew louder and more animated as the bids climbed. Victoria bid on the painting. She won it. She didn't particularly want it, but she bid on it because she needed something to do with her hands, and because Henry Castellan looked delighted when she won, and at that moment she needed the company of people who were genuinely glad she existed. And then the MC took back the microphone after the auction ended and announced that the floor was open for any final remarks or acknowledgments from the guests. There was a pause, and Chloe Carter stood up. She was 3 tables back. She looked directly at the stage, at the microphone, at the MC. She said, loudly enough to be heard at the surrounding tables, I'd like to say something. The MC, who did not know who Chloe Carter was or that anything unusual was happening, handed over the microphone with a pleasant smile. Chloe walked to the front of the room. She walked like someone who had rehearsed this moment, like someone who had played it out in her mind 100 times and arrived at the version that gave her the most power, the most visibility, the most complete and total victory. Her red gown caught the light from the chandeliers. Her chin was up. Her expression was something between triumph and performance, the look of a woman who believes the audience is already on her side. She took the microphone, she smiled, and she said, I want to raise a glass to new chapters. The phrase landed in the room, and several people smiled reflexively, still riding the warmth of Daniel's speech, not yet understanding. Because I think Daniel said it perfectly, Chloe continued. The courage to follow your heart, the willingness to begin again. She paused, and then she looked directly at Daniel, to the man who chose courage, and to the new beginning we're building together. The room went very quiet, not the quiet of a toast being received, the quiet of 600 people simultaneously understanding that something was wrong, that they were witnessing something they did not expect to witness, that the evening had just fundamentally changed. Daniel went completely still at table 1. Chloe raised her glass higher and looked directly at Victoria. Not accidentally, not in the incidental way that eyes sweep across a crowd. She looked at Victoria with full, deliberate, calculated intention. She looked at her the way you look at someone when you want them to know they have already lost. To better chapters, Chloe said, and better women. 2 or 3 people at Chloe's table raised their glasses, unsure, confused, following social instinct rather than understanding. Everyone else held perfectly still. Victoria felt every pair of eyes in the room turned toward her. She sat with her back straight and her hands in her lap and her face composed into an expression of complete, unreadable calm. Not the calm of shock, not the calm of someone who has just been hit and hasn't felt it yet. The calm of someone who saw this coming from a very long way away and is now simply watching it arrive. She did not stand up, she did not reach for her glass, she did not say a word. She looked at Chloe Carter across the ballroom, and she thought, very clearly, you made your move. Now watch what happens next. Chloe seemed to expect that this would be the moment Victoria broke. That she would cry or flee, or shout, or collapse into the humiliation of being publicly discarded in front of everyone she knew. That seemed to be the version of this evening Chloe had scripted in her mind. The version where the older wife fell apart and the younger woman stood victorious above the wreckage. What she had not scripted was Victoria's absolute stillness. What she had not planned for was silence. The stillness confused her. Victoria watched the confusion move across Chloe's face, just a flicker. Just a moment of, this is not how this is supposed to go, and in that flicker Victoria felt the very first shift of the evening. The first microscopic movement of power. Henry Castellan leaned close to Victoria's ear. He said very quietly, "Do you want me to do something?" Victoria said, "No, thank you, Henry. I'm fine. You're sure?" "Quite sure." He straightened up. He looked at Daniel with an expression that could have stripped paint from a wall. Across the room, Marianne Cole had appeared at the MC's side, speaking urgently into his ear. The MC gently took the microphone back from Chloe with a murmured apology about the program schedule. And the evening technically resumed, but no one in the room was paying attention to the program anymore. Every conversation, in every cluster, at every table, was the same conversation. Did that just happen? What is she going to do? Who is that woman? "Oh, I've heard about this. Poor Victoria." That was the phrase moving through the room like water through cracks, and Victoria hated it. Not because it was unkind, the people saying it meant it kindly, meant it with genuine sympathy, but because it assumed that being the object of someone else's cruelty made you a victim. It assumed that the story ended here in this ballroom, with Chloe's glass raised and Victoria sitting with her hands in her lap. Victoria did not intend for the story to end here. She reached for her own champagne glass, finally, and took a slow, deliberate sip. She set it back down. She turned to the man on her right, a museum director she had been speaking with earlier in the evening, and she said, entirely naturally, "You were telling me about the Flemish collection earlier. The Rubens acquisition. I want to hear more about that." The museum director stared at her for a moment, then something in his face reset. "Of course," he said, "yes, it was actually a fascinating process." And Victoria listened, because this was the most important thing she could do in this moment. Not fight back, not react, not give Chloe Carter the drama she came here to perform. The most important thing was to demonstrate to every person watching that she was not undone, that she could sit in the rubble of a very public humiliation and conduct herself with the same grace she had walked in with, because her grace was not dependent on the circumstances. It was not on loan from a happy marriage, it was hers. Daniel excused himself from the table 6 minutes after Chloe's little speech. Victoria did not watch him go. She heard his chair push back and she heard his footsteps, and she did not turn her head. She imagined he was going to find Chloe. She imagined there was a conversation happening somewhere near the bar, or in the corridor, or perhaps in the quiet alcove near the coat room where she and Daniel had once stood 15 years ago during another gala, slightly drunk on good wine and very much in love, talking about what they would name their children. They had never had children. She had mourned that for a long time. Tonight, for the first time, she thought, at least there is that. Henry Castellan did not leave the table. He sat beside her like a wall, like something solid and warm and completely immovable, and he talked to her about his grandchildren and about a fishing trip he was planning for November and about a documentary he had seen about deep-sea octopuses, and she was so grateful for him that she thought she might cry from the sheer human decency of it. She did not cry. She talked about the octopuses. It had been 27 minutes since Chloe's toast. Victoria knew this because she had been tracking it precisely the way you track the minutes. When you are waiting for something, when you know something is coming and you cannot move the clock forward by wanting it to. And then the large doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. Not the side doors that waitstaff used, the main doors, the ceremonial ones, wide and tall, with their brass handles that caught the light from the chandeliers and threw it back in small, cold flashes. And Augustus Whitmore walked in. He was 71 years old, and he walked like a man who had never in his life entered a room that wasn't glad to see him. He was tall. Victoria had always thought of him as occupying more vertical space than his actual height accounted for. Something about the way he held himself, and he wore a tuxedo with the ease of someone who had been wearing tuxedos for 50 years, which he had. His hair was white and precise, and his posture was perfect, and his eyes swept the room the way they always swept rooms, methodically, recording everything, missing nothing. Beside him was Eleanor Whitmore. Victoria's mother was 68 years old and had been one of the most beautiful women in New York in her day, and was still, by any honest measure, remarkable. She wore champagne-colored silk. Her posture was even better than Augustus's. She had the gift of entering rooms and making them feel, immediately, as though she had always been the most important person in them, not through loudness or extravagance, but through a kind of absolute sureness about herself that broadcast itself without effort. And beside Eleanor, one step to the right, was Julian Whitmore. Julian was 43 years old. He was Victoria's younger brother by 4 years. He was also, depending on whom you asked, the most effective dealmaker in New York real estate and corporate litigation, a man whose quiet smile had preceded the professional destruction of 12 very powerful people who had each, at some point, made the mistake of underestimating him. He was not as tall as his father and not as striking as his mother, but he had both of their qualities in a compressed, more concentrated form, and when he walked into a room you felt the specific gravity of someone who is entirely sure of what they came to do. The three of them moved through the ballroom together. People noticed immediately. Henry Castellan was the first one at table 1 to react. He sat up straighter and turned slightly toward the doors and said, with a particular kind of satisfaction, that as the satisfaction of a man who had just watched something he hoped would happen actually happen. Well, just that one word, well. Victoria turned toward the doors and looked at her family crossing the ballroom floor. She had not asked them to come tonight. She had not told them what was happening. She had called her mother 2 weeks ago, the kind they had been making every Sunday for 30 years. And somewhere in the middle of that call, between the discussion of the Newark Arts Center and the question about whether Augustus's knee was healing properly, Eleanor had said, "How are you really?" And Victoria had been quiet for a moment, and then she had said, "I'm managing." And Eleanor, who had raised 2 children and built a marriage and navigated 68 years of life with extraordinary intelligence and almost no sentimentality, had said, "The gala is Thursday." "Yes, we'll be there. You don't have to." Thursday, Eleanor had said in the tone that meant the conversation was finished. Victoria had not argued. She had never once in her life successfully argued with that tone. She had simply thought, they are coming. And she had felt for the first time in 6 months that she was not entirely alone inside this. Augustus reached table 1 first. He put his hand on his daughter's shoulder and bent down, and kissed her on the top of her head, the way he had been kissing her on the top of her head since she was 4 years old. And he said, very quietly, close to her ear, "You look beautiful." "Hi, Dad," she said. Her voice, to her own enormous surprise and private fury, came out with the smallest catch in it. Just a fraction. Just the tiniest signal of how much of the evening she had been holding in her body, and what it meant to her that they were here. Augustus straightened up. He looked at the table. He looked at the empty chair where Daniel had been sitting. He looked at his daughter's champagne glass and at her hands in her lap and at the careful, controlled arrangement of her faces. And something moved through Augustus Whitmore's eyes that Victoria had seen only a handful of times in her life. It was not anger exactly. It was something older and colder and more absolute than anger. It was the specific quality of a man who has just confirmed something he suspected and who has already decided, in the same instant, what to do about it. He said nothing. He straightened his jacket. He looked out across the ballroom. Eleanor sat beside Victoria and took her hand. She didn't say anything either. She just held Victoria's hand in both of hers with a pressure that was firm and warm and said everything that mattered without requiring a single word. Julian scanned the room quickly, efficiently, the way you scan a room when you are looking for something specific. His eyes found Chloe Carter near the bar, still in her red dress, now looking less triumphant and more uncertain, the first real cracks appearing in the victory she had come here to celebrate. Julian looked at Chloe for 3 seconds. Then he looked at the corridor exit nearest to the bar, and then he looked at his father. Augustus gave a single small nod. Julian walked toward the bar. Chloe saw him coming. She did not know who he was. That was clear from the politely curious expression she arranged on her face as he approached, the expression of someone preparing to meet a stranger at a social event, composing herself into the version of herself she presented to new people. Warm, confident, certain of her own standing in the room. Julian stopped in front of her. He did not offer his hand. He said, in the pleasantly conversational tone he used when he was delivering information that was going to be very unpleasant, "My name is Julian Whitmore. Victoria Hayes is my sister. I think you know who Victoria is." Chloe's expression shifted. The warmth drained out of it slowly, like heat leaving a room. "Of course," she said. "Good," Julian said. "Then this will be efficient. In about 48 hours, a review of your employment contract with Hayes Dynamics is going to become a professional matter rather than a personal one. I would recommend you use those 48 hours to consult with your own attorney, because the terms of your original appointment to the strategy division involve some fiduciary considerations that my colleagues find very interesting." He paused. "I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening." He turned and walked away. He did not look back. Chloe stood completely still for a long moment, her champagne glass in her hand, and the victory she had walked into this room carrying began, very quietly, to come apart. 3 tables away, Daniel Hayes was having a different conversation. He had come back into the ballroom from the corridor, presumably after whatever he and Chloe had said to each other in the hall, and he had stopped when he saw the Whitmores at table 1. He stood near the edge of the room for a moment, visibly calculating. Victoria could see him from where she was sitting. She could see the exact moment he recognized that something had changed. Augustus turned and saw him. For a man of 71, Augustus Whitmore covered the distance between the table and the edge of the room with remarkable speed. He was not running. He was walking with absolute, deliberate purpose, and there is a particular kind of walking that can feel faster than running to the person watching it. Daniel held his ground. To his credit, or perhaps to the limit of his instinct, he did not retreat. Augustus stopped 2 feet in front of him. He looked at his son-in-law for a long, measured moment. Around them, the nearest guests had registered the encounter and fallen silent. The social machinery of the evening kept moving, people talking, glasses clinking, a waiter navigating through with a tray, but in this particular corner of the room, the air had gone very still. Augustus said, "I see you're making choices tonight, Daniel." Daniel said, "Augustus, I'm not finished," Augustus said. Daniel closed his mouth. 22 years, Augustus said. "My daughter has given you 22 years and everything she had in her to give. I watched her stand in this room tonight with more grace and more strength than most people have in a lifetime, and I watched you not be worth a single moment of it." He paused. "I want you to hear me clearly when I tell you that the personal consequences of what you've done tonight are your business and hers. But the professional consequences, the question of what Hayes Dynamics does in the next 30 days, are going to be a conversation you and I and several other people are going to have very soon." "Is that a threat?" Daniel asked. His voice had gone slightly hoarse. "It is a fact," Augustus said. "There's a difference." "I thought you understood the difference. That was apparently one of many things I misunderstood about you." He held Daniel's gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he turned with the particular unhurried precision of a man who never needed the last word because the point had already been made, and he walked back to table 1. He sat down next to Victoria. "How are you doing?" he asked her, as though they were having a perfectly ordinary conversation. Victoria looked at her father. She felt something behind her eyes that she absolutely refused to allow to become tears. "I'm doing," she said. "That's enough," he said. "For tonight, that's enough." And in the grand ballroom of the Hartwell Hotel, with 600 people, navigating the remainder of an evening that had become something none of them had anticipated, Victoria Whitmore Hayes sat between her mother and her father with her back straight and her hands steady, and she felt, for the first time in 6 months, The specific weight of the thing she had been carrying began just barely, just at the edges to lift. She had not planned a confrontation. She had not arrived tonight planning to win anything. She had arrived tonight prepared to survive, and survival had looked, from the outside, like dignity. And dignity, it turned out, had been enough to change everything. Chloe Carter stood alone near the bar in her warm red dress and her lifted chin, and she was beginning, in the slow and terrible way of dawning realizations, to understand that she had made a catastrophic miscalculation. She had walked into this room believing she held all the power. She had announced her victory to the wrong audience, in front of the wrong people, at the worst possible moment. And the woman she had tried to break was sitting across the room with her family around her like a fortress. The evening wasn't over, but the story of who had won it was already being written. And it was not the story Chloe had come here to tell. The night did not end cleanly, nothing that real ever does. By 10:45, the gala had technically continued, the program wrapped, the final auction items sold. The foundation's chair delivered closing remarks with the particular professional composure of a woman, determined not to acknowledge that her event had just become the most talked about social incident in New York in recent memory. But the room had changed. You could feel it in the way people held their conversations, leaning slightly inward, voices just below their normal register. You could feel it in the careful choreography of who looked where and who avoided whose eye, and who found a sudden pressing need to check their phone. Chloe Carter left the ballroom at 10:52. Victoria noticed the moment she walked out. Not because she was watching for it, she had genuinely stopped watching Chloe, had made a deliberate internal decision to stop tracking her movements the way a person stops watching a storm once they're safely inside, but because the energy in the room shifted when she left. Something that had been pulled tight, released by about 10%. Several people exhaled. Someone near the bar laughed too loudly, the way people laugh when they're releasing tension rather than responding to something funny. Daniel left 12 minutes later. He did not say goodbye to Victoria. He did not approach table 1. He did not look at his wife, or at her father, or at Julian, who had returned to the table after his conversation with Chloe and was now sitting with the easy, relaxed posture of a man who has completed a task and is entirely satisfied with the result. Daniel simply walked out through the side corridor, and the door closed behind him, and that was the last Victoria saw of her husband on the night that their marriage ended in public. Augustus watched him go. "I'll call Morrison in the morning," he said. He meant Richard Morrison, the family's lead attorney. He said it the way you say something that's already been decided. A simple statement of logistics, rather than a question requiring anyone's approval. Victoria said, "Dad, not tonight." Augustus looked at her. "Tonight," she said, "I just want to get through tonight." Something moved across her father's face. The particular frustrations of a man who fixes things for a living, confronting the fact that some things cannot be fixed on his timeline, and then it settled into something else. Acceptance, maybe. Or love wearing the clothes of restraint. "All right," he said. "Tonight." Eleanor was still holding Victoria's hand. She had not let go once in the past hour. Victoria was aware of her mother's grip the way she was aware of her own heartbeat constantly, without having to think about it, a steady reminder that something essential was still working. Henry Castellan stood and said his goodbyes with a warmth and a discretion that Victoria would remember for the rest of her life. He kissed her cheek and said nothing about what had happened. He talked about the painting she had won at the auction and said he thought it would look magnificent in her study. He said it as though the evening had been entirely normal, as though she had simply attended a charity gala and won a painting and had a lovely time. It was one of the kindest things anyone had ever done for her. She slept that night at her parents' brownstone on East 72nd Street. She did not plan to. They planned it for her. Quietly and efficiently, Eleanor telling the driver her parents' address while Augustus guided Victoria to the car, with one hand at the small of her back, and by the time Victoria registered that she was not going home to the apartment with Daniel, they were already uptown, and she thought, "I don't want to go home anyway. Not tonight, maybe not for a while." She lay in the guest bedroom, the room that had been her own bedroom from age 9 until she left for Yale, and she stared at the ceiling in the dark, and she did something she had not allowed herself to do in 6 months. She felt all of it. Not the anger that would come later, would arrive in waves she didn't expect at moments she didn't plan for. not the humiliation that was already starting to transform into something else, something harder and less corrosive. What she felt in the dark of that room was grief, pure and specific and devastating grief for the marriage she had believed she was living in, for the man she had thought she knew, for the 22 years of mournings and arguments and reconciliations and silences and all the small unremarkable moments that make up a life shared with another person. She cried for exactly 40 minutes. She knew it was 40 minutes because she watched the clock on the nightstand, and she gave herself set time deliberately, the way you allocate time to something necessary and finite. 40 minutes, and then she stopped. She pressed her palms flat on the mattress and breathed and thought, all right. You know what this is now, you know what it costs. Now figure out what comes next. She was still awake at 2 a.m. when her phone began. The first text was from a woman named Diane, who had been at the gala, and who was one of what Victoria had always privately categorized as social proximity friends, people she saw at events, who knew her name, who would not have called her in a crisis, but who evidently felt no such restraint about texting. The message said, Victoria, I just want you to know I think what happened tonight was absolutely disgusting, and you were magnificent. If you need anything at all, please reach out. Victoria read it. She put the phone face down. It lit up again in 90 seconds. By 2:30, she had received 41 messages. She did not read most of them. She read the 3 that were from people she actually trusted, and those 3 said variations of the same thing. I'm here. Whatever you need, take your time. She put the phone in the drawer of the nightstand and closed it. She did not sleep until 4. At 7:15 in the morning, Julian knocked on the bedroom door. I know you're awake, he said through the door. You've been awake for 2 hours. I can tell because you stopped the floorboard from creaking by stepping around it, which means you've been to the bathroom twice and back, wash, which means you've been lying in bed not sleeping. Victoria opened the door. Julian was already dressed. He had a coffee in each hand and he looked infuriatingly, completely rested. This had always been one of the most aggravating things about her brother. He processed difficult situations the way a computer processes data rapidly, without visible distress, arriving at outputs while other people were still identifying the problem. He held out a coffee. She took it. How bad? She asked. Societally, it's already everywhere. Someone filmed Chloe's toast on their phone. The video has been shared approximately. He checked his own phone 4,300 times as of 7 this morning. Victoria absorbed this. On what platform? All of them. She drank her coffee. Daniel hasn't been home. His card was used at the Hudson Hotel at 11:58 last night. Julian said this without inflection, without editorial comment, without the particular tone that people use when they're trying to soften information. He knew she didn't want softening. He had always known that. Is she with him? Unknown, probably, Victoria nodded. And professionally? Julian sat down on the edge of the chair near the window. This is the part I need you to be clear-headed for, Vic. I'm clear-headed. Hayes Dynamics opens at 9. Daniel is scheduled to chair a board call at 10. There are 3 significant investors in that company, Hartwell Capital and Prescott Partners, who have very strong opinions about optic conduct and reputational exposure. I made some calls last night, quiet calls, just asking questions, raising certain observations. Victoria looked at her brother. What kind of observations? She asked. The kind that serious investors find relevant when assessing whether the person chairing their investment is exercising sound judgment. Julian paused. The kind that become very interesting when combined with the fact that the person making those judgment calls was filmed last night as the subject of a public spectacle created by an employee of his own company. Julian, Victoria set her coffee down. What exactly did you say to those people? I said nothing that wasn't true. That isn't what I asked. He met her eyes. I said that Daniel Hayes had made a series of personal decisions that had recently come to light in a very public way, and that as someone with close knowledge of the situation, I had significant concerns about his decision-making capacity at the executive level. And then I let them draw their own conclusions. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. She picked her coffee back up. Dad was going to call Morrison this morning. Dad already called Morrison last night, at 11:30. Morrison is coming here at 9. She had known this was coming. She had told herself to take one night, just one night, before the machinery started moving. But the machinery had started moving before she even fell asleep, because the machinery was her family, and her family did not know how to be still in the presence of a problem. She could not decide whether she was grateful or exhausted by this. Both probably. Both. Richard Morrison arrived at 9 on the dot. He was 65, silver-haired, and had been the Whitmore family's lead attorney since before Victoria was born. He had drafted her parents' prenuptial agreement. He had handled the trust documents for both Victoria and Julian. He had seen the family through 3 separate business crises over 4 decades and had emerged from each one with his hair slightly more silver and his judgment slightly more precise. He sat across from Victoria at the dining room table with a legal pad and a pen and looked at her with the specific expression
of a man who has been in difficult rooms for a very long time and is entirely comfortable in them.
"Tell me everything," he said. "Don't edit, don't protect anyone. Just tell me." Victoria told him. She told him everything she had observed over the past 6 months. The behavioral shifts in Daniel, the cleared browser histories, the schedule changes, the professional relationship with Chloe that had moved over 18 months, from mentorship to something that was no longer professional by any honest definition. She told him about the holiday party. She told him about the speech at the gala. She told him about Chloe and the microphone, and the finger pointed at her across the room like a weapon. She told it all flatly, without dramatics, without editorializing. Just the sequence of facts as she had experienced them. Morrison wrote steadily. He did not interrupt. He asked 3 clarifying questions. He went back over 2 points. When she finished, he set his pen down and looked at her. "The prenuptial agreement you and Daniel signed in 2003, he said. "Are you familiar with Section 14? "It's been 22 years, Richard. Section 14 covers conduct provisions. Specifically, it defines terms under which the asset distribution outlined in Section 8 can be significantly altered." He paused. Daniel's conduct last night, the public nature of the relationship with a subordinate employee, the speech that any reasonable person would interpret as a public declaration of the affair that constitutes a potential trigger under Section 14. Victoria felt something shift inside her chest, not relief, not triumph, something more complicated than either of those. "What does that mean in practical terms?" she asked. "It means," Morrison said carefully, "that if you choose to pursue divorce proceedings, your position is significantly stronger than standard marital dissolution. It means the apartment, the beach house, and your contributions to Hayes Dynamics during the years of the marriage are all on the table in a way that wouldn't otherwise be the case." He folded his hands on the legal pad. "It also means Daniel's attorneys are going to know this the moment they review the documents, which means he has a strong incentive to settle quickly and quietly rather than litigate." "And Chloe?" Julian asked from across the table. Morrison glanced at him. "Ms. Carter's situation is separate but related. Her employment contract with Hayes Dynamics contains non-fraternization provisions that are fairly standard for senior strategy staff. The relationship with the CEO, if it can be established and given last night's very public evidence, that bar is low, constitutes a breach." He paused again. "Additionally, there are questions about whether certain strategic decisions made in the past 12 months may have been influenced by the relationship in ways that the board would find troubling." Augustus, who had been sitting at the end of the table, without speaking for the past 40 minutes, said, "Establish it." Morrison nodded once. Victoria said, "I want this handled carefully." Every head at the table turned toward her. "I don't want scorched earth," she said. "I want what's fair. I want what's mine. I want my name and my dignity intact, and I want to be able to walk out of this marriage with my identity not defined entirely by the fact that it happened." She looked at Morrison. "Can you do that?" "Yes," Morrison said. "Then do it," she said. But carefully understood, the meeting lasted 2 more hours. By the end of it, the legal framework of what was coming had been sketched in broad strokes, the specific next steps assigned to specific people, the timeline established. Victoria signed 2 initial authorization documents and shook Morrison's hand and walked him to the door, and then stood in the hallway of her parents' house for a moment with her hand still on the doorknob. She could hear her parents talking quietly in the dining room. She could hear Julian on his phone 2 words in, already managing something, already moving pieces. She pressed her forehead against the cool wood of the door for just a moment. And then she straightened up and walked back into the dining room, because there was no version of this where she got to stand still. Daniel called at 11:47. She was in her parents' study when the phone rang, her own phone, the one she had almost left in the nightstand drawer. His name on the screen produced a response in her body that she registered neutrally, the way you register weather. Her heart rate went up. Her hands were steady, she answered. "Victoria," he said. She said nothing. "I know there's nothing I can say that." He stopped. Started again. "I know last night was I know how it looked." "How it looked," she repeated. I didn't know she was going to do that. The speech that was supposed to be just about the foundation. I didn't mean for it to. "Daniel," her voice was very quiet, very level. "Don't tell me what you meant. You've been lying to me for a year. Don't stand on the wreckage of that and ask me to care about your intentions." A long silence. "I'm sorry," he said, and it sounded real. It sounded like the most real thing he had said to her in months, which made it, in its own specific way, the most painful thing she had heard in months. "I know you are," she said. "You'll be hearing from Richard Morrison." She ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment and thought, 22 years. 22 years of Sunday mornings and bad days at work and hospital waiting rooms and inside jokes that nobody else understood, and learning the specific geography of another human being so thoroughly that you could navigate them in the dark. 22 years, and she had ended it in 48 seconds on a phone call in her parents' study. She put the phone down on the desk. She thought it was over before the phone call. It was over before last night. It was over the moment he decided she was someone you lied to instead of someone you talked to. She was just the last one to hold the death certificate. At 2:15 in the afternoon, her best friend Margot arrived. Margot Chen was 44 years old, a surgeon with the specific combination of warmth and precision that made her excellent at her job and an extraordinary friend to have in a crisis. She and Victoria had known each other since their freshman year at Yale, which meant she had 26 years of context and exactly zero patience for anything other than the truth. She walked in with food, real food, not sympathy food, not the casseroles and pastries that people brought when they didn't know what else to do, but a specific collection of things she knew Victoria actually ate. Spicy ramen from the place on Lex, dark chocolate. Container of cold brew coffee, a bottle of very good whiskey. She set everything on the kitchen counter and looked at Victoria and said, "Tell me you didn't watch the video." Victoria said, "I haven't looked at my phone since 8 this morning." "Good, don't, it's bad." "How bad?" Margot hesitated. "Margot, it's been shared about 50,000 times. It's on 3 different entertainment news sites. Someone on Reddit made a thread called The Most Iconic Non-Reaction in New York Gala History, and it has," she checked her phone, 62,000 upvotes. Victoria stared at her. "You," Margot said carefully, "have become unexpectedly iconic. I don't want to be iconic, I want to be left alone." "I know. But here's the thing. Vic and I'm telling you this because I love you, and because you need to hear it before you see it the way the video looks. The way you look. Sitting there completely still while she does. All of that, you don't look like a victim. You look like the only adult in the room. And the internet, for once in its entire miserable existence, has noticed." Victoria was quiet. She said, "What about Daniel?" Margot's expression shifted. "He's issued a statement through Hayes Dynamics PR. It says the company is not commenting on personal matters and remains focused on its business commitments." "Of course it does." His stock dropped 2 points when the market opened this morning. Victoria absorbed this. "And Chloe?" "She posted something on social media this morning. It's been deleted now." It was Margot stopped. "Tell me." It was a photo of herself with a caption that said something about standing in her truth and not apologizing for love. About 14,000 people told her to sit down. Margot paused. She deleted it within 2 hours. Victoria closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about Chloe Carter at 29, standing in a ballroom in a red dress, raising a glass at the wrong person in front of the wrong room, believing so completely in the certainty of her victory that she never once stopped to ask, "What if I've miscounted the people in this story?" She thought, "You are very young. And being young does not make you cruel, but it does sometimes make you catastrophically certain." She said, "I don't want her destroyed." Margot looked at her. "I mean it," Victoria said. "What she did was wrong. What she did was humiliating and deliberate and wrong. But she's 29 years old, and she's going to have to live with having done it. And that's enough. I don't need her destroyed." "Morrison is already involved," Margot said carefully. "Morrison is handling what's fair," Victoria said. "That's different from destruction." She looked at her friend. "Daniel made choices. Chloe made choices. I'm not interested in becoming someone who defines herself by making other people pay. I'm interested in figuring out who I am without all of this." Margot was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the whiskey bottle. "Okay," she said, "but first can we just—" "Yes," Victoria said. "Absolutely yes." Margot poured. They sat at the kitchen table in her parents' house and they talked for 3 hours. Not about Daniel, not about lawyers, not about stock prices or viral videos or what the entertainment news sites were saying. They talked about Victoria, about who she had been before she became Daniel's wife, about the things she had put aside because marriages require compromise, and she had compromised without fully realizing how much she had, about the Whitmore Foundation work that had been her own and had felt like her own, and had continued to grow quietly and steadily while her marriage was falling apart around her. Margot said, "You know what I noticed watching you last night from across the room?" Victoria said, "What? You weren't scared?" Victoria thought about this. "I was." "No," Margot said, "you were in pain, that's different. Pain and fear are different things, and you were in pain, but you weren't scared. And the reason you weren't scared is that you already knew you were going to be okay. You just hadn't admitted it to yourself yet." Victoria looked at her friend. She said, "When did you get so wise?" Margot said, "I've been this wise the whole time. You were just distracted." At 4 in the afternoon, Julian knocked on the kitchen door and opened it without waiting. He had his phone in his hand and his jacket off, and his expression was the specific expression he wore when something unexpected had happened, and he was deciding how to frame it. Victoria said, "What?" Julian said, "Prescott Partners pulled out of the Hayes Dynamics Q1 commitment." The room went very still. Prescott Partners was not the largest of Hayes Dynamics' 3 major investors, but it was the most strategically positioned, and its commitment had been used as leverage in 3 subsequent deals. Its withdrawal was not in isolation a death blow, but it was a signal, and in the world of corporate finance, signals were often worth more than the actual event. When, Victoria asked, "An hour ago." "Formally," Julian paused. "The letter cites evolving concerns about executive leadership stability," which is corporate language for last night, Victoria said. Augustus appeared in the doorway behind Julian. He had obviously already heard. He looked at Victoria and said, "I made no direct calls to Prescott." "I know," Victoria said. "I want to be clear about that. What Prescott did, they did on their own judgment." "I know, Dad." He nodded. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he said, "Daniel built something real with that company. I want to be fair about that. He built something real." He paused. "And now he's watching it become uncertain, because he couldn't make a decision worth the name." Victoria said, "He'll manage it," maybe, Augustus said. "But he'll manage it without the infrastructure he had yesterday. And he'll know the difference." She was quiet. This was not what she had wanted. She had told Morrison she wanted fair, not scorched earth. But she was beginning to understand that some consequences did not wait for your preferences. Some consequences were simply the shape of the thing you had done, the natural and inevitable form of the damage, arriving whether you invited them or not. Daniel had stood in a ballroom and lit a match. She had not chosen the fire's direction. At 6:45, her phone showed a new notification. Not a call, not a text, an email forwarded by Julian's assistant with no subject line. It was from Chloe Carter. Victoria stared at the name in her inbox for a long moment. Then she opened it. The email was 4 paragraphs long. It did not begin with an apology. It began with, "I know you have no reason to read this." It then became paragraph by paragraph, one of the more remarkable things Victoria had read in recent memory. Chloe wrote about the night she had rehearsed in her mind for weeks, about the certainty she had felt, standing in that ballroom, that she was on the right side of history, the right side of love, the right side of the story. About the moment, and she named it precisely, placed it at the exact second the moment Victoria did not react, when her certainty had first cracked. She wrote, "I think I told myself a story about what I was doing. I think I had to do it, and I think I knew from the moment you just sat there and looked at me that the story was wrong, that I had been the villain in somebody else's narrative the whole time and hadn't let myself see it." She did not ask Victoria to forgive her. She did not ask for anything. The last line of the email said, "I resigned from Hayes Dynamics this afternoon. I thought you should know from me, not from a press release." Victoria read the email twice. Then she put the phone down on the table and looked at the wall for a moment. Margot said, "Who is that?" Victoria said, "Someone who's figuring some things out." She did not forward the email to Julian. She did not show it to her parents. She did not respond to it, because she did not yet know what to say, and she had learned a long time ago that the right response to something you don't yet understand is silence, not noise. She made a cup of tea. She sat at the kitchen table in her parents' house with the tea in both hands and the October light fading in the window behind her, and she thought about the gala last night, which felt simultaneously like 6 hours ago and 6 years ago. She thought about the ballroom and the microphone and the red dress and the finger pointed at her face like an accusation. She thought about her father walking in. She thought about her mother's hand in hers. She thought about Daniel standing in that ballroom, watching everything he had built in 22 years of marriage begin its quiet, irreversible collapse. She did not feel victorious. She did not feel vengeful. She felt more than anything tired. And underneath the tired, very far underneath, very quiet, barely audible against the noise of the past 24 hours, she felt something that took her a moment to identify because she had not felt it in such a long time. She felt free, not the freedom of someone who had been released, the freedom of someone who had stopped pretending, the freedom of a woman who no longer had to maintain the specific exhausting fiction of a marriage that had become a performance, who no longer had to sit across a kitchen table from a man she loved and pretend she didn't know he was lying to her, who no longer had to be every single day the composed and steady and dignified face of a life that was privately crumbling. She could just be Victoria. Victoria Whitmore, not Daniel's wife. Not the woman who stood still at the gala, not the object of 50,000 reposts and 62,000 Reddit upvotes and 112 text messages. Just herself. She pressed her hands around the warm mug and she thought, all right, you know who you are now, build from there. 3 days after the gala, Daniel Hayes called again. Not in the morning this time, at 11:40 at night, which told Victoria everything she needed to know about the state he was in. Sober people with clear consciences did not call at 11:40 at night. They called at reasonable hours with reasonable expectations. People who called at 11:40 were people who had been sitting with something all day and had finally run out of the willpower to not say it. She almost didn't answer. She answered, I need to talk to you, he said. Not through Morrison, not through your brother. I need to actually talk to you. Victoria was sitting in the guest bedroom at her parents' house, which she had now been occupying for 3 nights and which was beginning to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like the beginning of something permanent. She had her reading glasses on and a book in her lap that she had not read a single page of. She said, It's almost midnight, Daniel. I know what time it is. Then you understand that whatever you want to say could have been said at 2 in the afternoon. I couldn't say it at 2 in the afternoon. I couldn't say it at any point today because I spent all day in a room with 4 attorneys and a board member who flew in from Chicago specifically to tell me that my personal conduct has created what he called a material risk to investor. Confidence, his voice cracked slightly on the word material. I needed to get through that before I could call you. Victoria set the book down on the nightstand. She took off her reading glasses. She said, How bad was the board meeting? A pause. Long enough to mean something. Hartwell is watching, he said. Prescott is gone, which you probably already know. The Meridian Group is staying for now, but their managing partner sent a personal email asking for a call next week. He exhaled. 2 of my senior VPs have asked for private conversations, which, in corporate language, means they're deciding whether to start looking elsewhere. Victoria said nothing. I built that company for 18 years, Daniel said. I built it from 11 people in a rented office in Midtown into something with 400 employees and operations in 6 countries, and I am watching it start to shake because of one night. Because of he stopped. Because of choices you made, Victoria said. Not cruelly, just accurately. Yes, he said, and the way he said it flat, hollow, entirely absent of any defensive energy told her something important. The Daniel who had been lying to her for a year was gone. What was on the phone right now was what was left after the performance stopped. Because of choices I made, she let the silence sit for a moment. What do you want, Daniel? I want to understand how we got here, he said. I need to know if you knew before the gala. How long you knew. She considered this question. She considered whether he deserved the answer. 6 months, she said. She heard him breathe. 6 months, he repeated. Approximately. And you didn't say anything. No. Another silence. Then why? Because I wanted to be certain before I made any decision, she said. Because I understand that the way you leave something determines who you are on the other side of it. And because, if I'm being honest with you, which I am, even though the same courtesy was not extended to me, I spent a long time hoping I was wrong. The last sentence cost her something. She felt it leave her and felt the space it left behind. Daniel was quiet for a long time. He said, "I'm sorry, Victoria. I know it doesn't fix anything," she said. "But I believe you, and that will have to be enough, because it's all there is." She ended the call. She sat in the dark for a while. Then she called Margot, because that was what you did at midnight, when you had just done something hard and needed someone to confirm that you were still intact. Margot answered on the second ring, which meant she had been awake, which meant she had been waiting. "I talked to him," Victoria said. "How do you feel?" Victoria thought about it. "Like I just closed a door," she said. "And I'm standing in the hallway trying to remember which direction the next one is." "Forward," Margot said. "Always forward, Vic." By day 5, the legal machinery was fully in motion. Morrison had filed the initial documentation for dissolution of the marriage, citing the conduct provisions in Section 14 of the prenuptial agreement. Daniel's attorneys, a firm called Brannock and Slate, known specifically for handling high-stakes marital proceedings involving substantial assets, had responded within 24 hours, which confirmed what Morrison had predicted. They had reviewed the prenuptial agreement the moment the gala footage hit the internet, understood the implications of Section 14 immediately, and were moving toward a settlement framework rather than litigation. Morrison explained this to Victoria on a Friday morning at the Whitmore family offices on Park Avenue, where she had agreed to meet because she needed to be somewhere that felt like professional ground rather than personal shelter. "They want to settle," Morrison said quickly and quietly. "Their language is cooperative, which in my experience is their client understands his exposure and wants to minimize it." "Good," Victoria said. "There are 3 primary assets in question. The Riverside Drive apartment." "I don't want it," Victoria said. Morrison looked up from his notes. "It's worth $4.2 million, he said. "I know what it's worth. I don't want to live in it. Give me its value in other terms, but I don't want the apartment." Morrison made a note. "The Connecticut property. What are his feelings about the Connecticut property?" His attorneys indicated it has personal significance to him. Victoria thought about the Connecticut house, the one they had bought in their 3rd year of marriage. The one with the garden she had planted herself over 3 consecutive springs, adding to it each year, learning what grew and what didn't, learning the particular personality of that specific patch of land. The one where they had spent Christmas every year for 15 years. The one where she had, at various points, been genuinely and completely happy. She thought, let him have it. She thought, you cannot plant a garden in a house that has become a symbol of something that broke. "He can have Connecticut," she said. "I want fair value." "And Hayes Dynamics," Morrison said. "Your contributions during the marriage, the advisory role, the foundation introductions. This investor relationship work constitute a legitimate claim under the marital asset provisions. We're looking at a figure somewhere between." "I don't want Hayes Dynamics," Victoria said. "I don't want anything that's his in name. I want what's mine. My contributions fairly valued in cash, and I want my name back." Morrison set his pen down. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent 40 years in divorce proceedings and is not often surprised. "Your name back," he said. "Victoria Whitmore. That's who I was. That's who I'm going back to." He nodded slowly. "I'll make it the first line of the settlement requirements," he said. The settlement negotiations lasted 11 days. Victoria did not attend any of the formal sessions. Morrison represented her fully, consulting with her by phone twice daily, reporting on the progress in clean, precise summaries that told her exactly what she needed to know without editorializing. She appreciated this more than she could say. Everyone else in her life was editorializing. Her father wanted to know why she wasn't pushing harder on the Hayes Dynamics valuation. Julian had opinions about the Connecticut house. Eleanor, characteristically, said almost nothing, and then once, at dinner on the 7th day, said quietly, "You're being very generous with him." Just that. No follow-up, no pressure, just the observation offered and left. Victoria had said, "I'm being appropriate. There's a difference." Eleanor had looked at her for a moment and said, "Yes, I suppose there is." On the 8th day of negotiations, something happened that Morris had not anticipated. Daniel's attorneys requested a 24-hour pause in the proceedings, citing what they called new information that their client needed time to address internally. Morrison called Victoria at 7 in the evening. "What new information?" she asked. "We don't know yet," Morrison said. "But in my experience, when opposing counsel asks us pause after 8 days of cooperative negotiations, it means something has changed on their side." Something their client didn't tell them. Victoria said, "Find out what it is." Morrison found out within 4 hours. He called back at 11:15 that night. "There is a second property," he said. Victoria said, "I'm sorry." "A property in Daniel's name only, purchased 14 months ago. An apartment in Tribeca. 2 bedrooms, purchased for $1.8 million. It was not disclosed in the initial asset documentation his attorneys provided." Victoria sat very still. 14 months ago, which meant before the Hayes Dynamics holiday party. Which meant before she had seen Daniel look at Crocs' room and understood what she was seeing. Which meant the timeline she had constructed in her mind, 6 months of knowledge. 18 months of the affair's existence needed to be revised. "How did you find it?" she asked. "I didn't," Morrison said. "His attorneys found it." "I believe they found it. Their client just informed them of its existence," which he had apparently omitted to mention during their initial intake. A pause. "It is possible that the apartment was purchased for, or is currently occupied by Miss Carter." The room felt very quiet. Victoria said, "Is it in her name?" "No, Daniel's name only, but the timing and the prices point are significant," Victoria said. "Yes." She pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose and thought for a moment. She said, "Add it to the settlement, Victoria. Add it, fair value, same as the others. I don't want the apartment. I want its value. And I want it included because it exists and because he owns it and because failing to disclose it in the initial documentation was either deliberate or negligent, and either way, it belongs in the conversation." Morrison said, "This changes the settlement figure considerably." "I know, Daniel's attorneys are not going to be pleased." "Richard," Victoria said, very calmly, "I have been patient with this man for 6 months, and generous with him for 11 days, and I am asking for nothing that isn't mine. If his attorneys are not pleased, that is a problem they can discuss with their client, who purchased a secret apartment 14 months ago and forgot to mention it." A brief pause. "Understood," Morrison said. The next morning, Julian showed up at the Whitmore offices at 8:30 with 2 coffees and the particular expression he wore when he had information he was deciding how to deliver. Victoria said, "Just say it." Julian sat down. "The video has reached 400,000 shares. The thread on Reddit has picked up by 3 major news outlets. There are 2 journalists requesting comment from the Whitmore family. One of them is from the Times." Victoria absorbed this. "The framing," Julian said carefully, "is not sympathetic to Daniel." "I imagine not." Julian set his coffee down. "There's an opportunity here. The way this story is being told publicly, the wife who didn't break, the family that showed up, the woman who sat in the middle of all of it and didn't fall apart. People are responding to that. Women especially. Women who are older, who have been in long marriages, who understand the specific kind of quiet strength it takes to sit in that chair and not crack." Victoria looked at her brother. "I know what you're suggesting," she said. "I'm not suggesting you do anything exploitative," Julian said. "I'm suggesting that you have a choice right now about whether your story gets told by other people or by you. And if other people tell it, they're going to get parts of it wrong." "No comment," Victoria said. No comment to the Times. No comment to anyone, not now." She picked up her coffee. "When I have something to say, I'll say it. When I'm ready to speak, I'll speak. But I am not going to turn my marriage collapse into content." Julian studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. "Okay," she said. She picked up the first folder on her desk, the Whitmore Foundation's quarterly report, which she had been meaning to review for 2 weeks, and she opened it and began reading, and Julian understood that the conversation was finished. On the 11th day, the settlement was reached. Morrison called at 3:40 in the afternoon. His voice had the specific controlled evenness of a man delivering good news that he is being careful not to oversell. They accepted the revised terms, he said, including the Tribeca property. The final figure is he named it. Victoria listened. It was more than she had expected and less than Julian had argued for, which meant it was probably exactly right. Daniel's attorneys have requested a 30-day period before the filing becomes public record. Why? They want time to manage the professional communications around it. To get ahead of the story before it becomes a news item. Victoria thought about this. 48 hours, she said. "I'm sorry, they can have 48 hours, not 30 days. The settlement is signed in 48 hours or we proceed to litigation." Morrison was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I'll communicate that." Daniel's attorneys came back in 6 hours. They agreed to 48 hours. The documents were signed the next afternoon. Victoria sat at Morrison's conference table, with a pen in her hand and the settlement agreement in front of her, and she read every page herself, all 31 of them, without rushing, without looking up. Morrison sat across from her. His assistant brought water. No one spoke. When she reached the last page, she found the lines she had asked Morrison to put first. Going forward, Victoria will resume use of her legal name, Victoria Ann Whitmore. She signed her name, and for the first time in 22 years, she signed it as Victoria Whitmore. She put the pen down. She looked at the signature for a moment. Morrison said quietly, "Congratulations, not on the ending. On the beginning." She looked up at him. "Thank you, Richard," she said, "for everything." She walked out of Morrison's office at 4:30 in the afternoon into the early November air, which was cold and clear and smelled like the city does in autumn when the wind is coming off the river. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. She called her mother. Eleanor answered on the first ring. Victoria said, "It's done." A silence, then Eleanor said, "Are you all right?" Victoria thought about the question honestly. The way you think about a question when you're done performing the answer and just want to find the true one. "I think so," she said. "I think I will be." "That's the right answer," Eleanor said. "Come home for dinner." She went home for dinner. Her father opened a bottle of wine that he had been saving for something, he didn't say what, and he poured 4 glasses and they sat at the dining room table. The 4 of them, Augustus and Eleanor and Julian and Victoria, and they ate and talked, and at some point during the meal, Victoria realized that she was laughing. Genuinely laughing, at something Julian had said, one of his dry, precise observations delivered with that particular deadpan expression he had perfected by age 15. She was laughing, and it was real, and it was completely unexpected, and it felt in the specific context of the past 11 days like something close to a miracle. Augustus looked at her across the table when she laughed. He looked at her with the specific expression of a father who has been worried about his child and is watching the worry lift in real time. He said nothing, he just smiled and lifted his glass very slightly in her direction. She lifted hers back. It was 3 days after the settlement when the thing Victoria had not anticipated happened. She was at the Whitmore Foundation offices on Wednesday morning, back to work, back to the Newark Arts Center project, back to the specific and purposeful daily motion of doing something that mattered when her assistant Patricia knocked on the open office door and said, "There's a woman in the lobby asking to speak with you. She doesn't have an appointment. She says her name is Chloe Carter." The office went very quiet. Victoria looked at Patricia. Patricia, who was 61 years old and had been with the Whitmore Foundation for 14 years and had the loyalty and discretion of someone who understood exactly what she was protecting, looked back at her boss with an expression that said, "Say the word and I will make this person leave the building and never return." Victoria said, "Give me 5 minutes, then send her in." Patricia's eyebrows moved a 1/4 inch upward. She said, "Are you sure?" "Yes," Victoria said. Patricia nodded and withdrew. Victoria stood up from her desk. She walked to the window. She stood with her back to the door and thought about the email. The 4 paragraphs. "I think I told myself a story about what I was doing. And I think I knew from the moment you just sat there and looked at me that the story was wrong." She had not responded to that email. She thought, "All right, let's finish this in person." When Chloe Carter walked into the office 5 minutes later, she looked nothing like the woman in the red dress. She was wearing a dark coat and minimal makeup, and she had the specific exhausted quality of someone who has not slept well in 2 weeks, which Victoria recognized because she had been looking at that quality in her own mirror every morning. She stopped inside the door. She did not advance further into the room without invitation. Victoria turned around from the window. They looked at each other. Chloe said, "I almost didn't come." Victoria said, "Why did you?" "Because I owe you more than an email." She paused. "And because I've been trying to figure out what I actually owe you, and I keep arriving at the same answer, which is an apology, that I'm not sure you want and that I'm going to give you anyway." Victoria said nothing. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. Chloe sat, Victoria sat. For a moment neither of them spoke, which was its own kind of conversation. 2 women in a room with the wreckage of the same event between them, trying to find the version of honesty that didn't require anyone to perform anything. Chloe said, "I told myself it was love. I want to be honest about that because it's the part that's hardest to say out loud. I told myself it was love and that love justified everything, and I used that to not look at what I was actually doing." She looked at her hands. I'm 29 years old and I'm not going to use that as an excuse because it's not an excuse. But I genuinely believed that if he chose me, that meant something. That it meant I had won something real. Victoria said, "What do you think it meant?" Chloe was quiet for a moment. "I think it meant that he was a man who was capable of lying to someone he had been with for 22 years, she said. And that should have told me something about what he was capable of. She looked up. It didn't. Not until the gala, not until I stood there and you just sat there and I realized that I was the one who looked like I had lost something. Victoria studied the young woman across from her. She thought about what it cost to come to this office, to knock on the door without an appointment, to sit in this chair. She said, "What are you going to do now?" Chloe blinked. She had clearly not expected that question. She had expected anger or dismissal or cold tolerance at best. "I resigned," she said. "From Hayes Dynamics, I have some savings. I'm going to take some time to figure out who I am without a job title that I let define too much of my identity." She paused. "I might go home for a while. My parents are in Portland." Victoria nodded. She said, "That's a reasonable plan." Chloe looked at her. "You're not going to yell at you?" Victoria said. "No, you already know what you did. You knew it standing in that ballroom when I didn't react the way you expected. You don't need me to explain it to you. I expected you to hate me," Chloe said quietly. "I don't have the energy for that," Victoria said. "And more to the point, I don't have the interest. You made choices. Daniel made choices. The choices made consequences. The consequences are in motion. That's the whole story." Chloe said, "I'm sorry, for the gala specifically. The microphone, the pointing at you, that was." She stopped. "I don't have a word for what that was, except that it was one of the worst things I've ever done to another person." Victoria looked at her for a long moment. "I accept that," she said. "Not, it's okay. Not, I forgive you." Because it wasn't okay, and forgiveness was a more complicated and private process than a single conversation in an office could produce. "But I accept that, I hear you. I'm putting it down now." Chloe stood. She said, I hope things go well for you." Victoria stood too. She said, "Take care of yourself, Chloe." The young woman nodded. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and said, without turning around, "For what it's worth, in the video, when everyone was watching you, you looked like the most powerful person in the room." She left. Victoria stood behind her desk for a moment in the quiet of the office. She thought, 29 years old, figuring out who she is without the story she told herself. She thought, "I know what that feels like." She sat back down. She opened the Newark Arts Center file. She picked up her pen, and Victoria Whitmore went back to work. But at 5 minutes past noon, Patricia knocked again. "Phone call," she said. "Line 2. It's a woman named Sandra Okafor from the Meridian Women's Leadership Fund. She says she saw something about you this week, and she wants to talk about a potential partnership with the Whitmore Foundation." Victoria looked up. Sandra Okafor ran one of the most respected women's professional development organizations in the country. Victoria had met her once briefly at a conference 3 years ago. She had thought at the time, "I would like to know her better." Patricia said, "Should I take a message?" Victoria said, "No. I'll take it." She picked up line 2. She said, "Sandra, this is Victoria Whitmore." And on the other end of the phone, someone said, "Victoria, I've been wanting to make this call for a long time, but I needed to wait for the right moment. I think the right moment is now." Victoria leaned back in her chair. She thought, yes. She thought, I think it is. The call with Sandra Okafor lasted 53 minutes. Victoria had expected a polite, exploratory conversation, the kind that happens between two organizations feeling out whether there is enough common ground to justify a follow-up meeting. What she got, instead, was something considerably more substantive, and by the time she set the phone down, Patricia was standing in the doorway with a legal pad and a look that said she had heard enough of one side of the conversation to know something significant had just happened. "Well," Patricia said, "the Meridian Women's Leadership Fund wants to co-sponsor a professional development initiative targeting women over 45 who are navigating major life transitions." Victoria set her pen down. Career pivots, post-divorce rebuilding, re-entry into the workforce after caregiving. Sandra has been developing the framework for 2 years. She's been looking for a foundation partner with operational capacity and a credible reputation. Patricia said, "And she called you the week your divorce settlement was signed." "She called me," Victoria said carefully, "because she has been following the Whitmore Foundation's work for 3 years. and because recent events brought my name to her attention in a way that made the timing feel appropriate. Patricia looked at her for a moment. Are you bothered by that? Victoria considered the question honestly. I thought I would be. A week ago I would have been. But no. If something painful happens and it creates an opening for something useful, that seems like the best possible outcome of the pain. She pulled the legal pad toward her and began writing notes from the call while they were still precise in her mind. The framework Sandra had described was ambitious, a 12-month program combining mentorship, skills assessment, financial literacy, and professional network access, designed specifically for women who found themselves rebuilding an identity that had been partially constructed around a relationship or a role that no longer existed. Women like Victoria herself. She did not say this to Patricia, but she thought it, and the thought did not embarrass her the way it might have 2 weeks earlier, the way it would have embarrassed her before she stopped needing these distance between herself and the truth. She wrote for 20 minutes, then she called Julian. I need you to look at something, she said when he answered. A partnership structure. Whitmore Foundation and the Meridian Women's Leadership Fund. Co-sponsored initiative. I'll send you the outline in an hour. Julian said, Sandra Okafor's organization, you know her? I know of her. She's serious, smart. The fund's financials are clean and their program outcomes are well documented. A brief pause. Did she call you or did you call her? She called me. Another pause, and Victoria could practically hear her brother recalibrating. That's interesting. That's what I thought, Victoria said. Look at the outline when I send it. Tell me if the structure makes sense. She spent the rest of the afternoon at her desk, which was the first afternoon in 3 weeks that had felt entirely like work, rather than crisis management. The Newark Arts Center, a grant application from a community theater in the South Bronx, the quarterly donor report that needed her sign-off before it went to the printer. She moved through it methodically and with genuine focus, and at 6:15, when Patricia knocked to say goodnight, Victoria realized that she had not thought about Daniel Hayes in approximately 4 hours. She held that fact for a moment. Then she nodded to herself and went back to the grant application. She had moved out of her parents' house by the second week of November. Not far. She had taken a furnished apartment on the Upper West Side, 12 blocks from where she had grown up, a 2-bedroom on the 14th floor that belonged to a friend of Eleanor's who was spending the winter in Lisbon and had offered it without making a production of the gesture. It was temporary, and everyone understood it was temporary, and no one said the word temporary, which was exactly right. She brought very little from the Riverside Drive apartment. Her clothes, her mother's diamond earrings, a painting she had bought for herself 15 years ago at a gallery in Chelsea, not the auction painting from the gala, which was being stored, but an older piece, abstract, all blues and grays, that had always hung in the room she thought of as hers rather than theirs. Her books, the specific collection of objects that had been given to her by people she loved, a paperweight from her father, a photograph of her and Margot at Yale graduation, a small clay bowl Julian had made in a ceramics class when they were children that was genuinely terrible and entirely precious. She left the rest. She left it without ceremony, going through the apartment on a Tuesday morning while Daniel was at work, taking what was hers and leaving what was his and what was theirs, with no particular sentiment and no particular cruelty, the practical dismantling of a shared life. She did look at the kitchen table on her way out. She stood there for about 10 seconds looking at it. The table where they had eaten 10,000 dinners, where she had edited his speeches, where she had sat across from him for 22 years of ordinary Tuesday mornings that she had believed at the time were unremarkable. Then she picked up her bag and left. 3 days into the new apartment, Margot came over with wine and Vietnamese food, and they sat on the floor because the furniture wasn't arranged yet, and ate out of containers and talked until almost 1 in the morning. It was the best Victoria had felt in longer than she could precisely identify. At 10:45 that same night, Victoria's phone showed a news alert. She saw it before she could decide not to. Hayes Dynamics CEO steps back from day-to-day operations amid company review. She stared at the headline for a moment. Then she turned the phone face down without reading the article. Margot, who had seen her expression, said, "What?" "Nothing," Victoria said. "Nothing I need to deal with tonight." Margot looked at her carefully. "Are you sure?" "Yes." Victoria picked up her wine. "Tell me about the hospital. Tell me about something completely unrelated to any of this." Margot studied her for one more second, then she said, "Okay. So we had a patient last week who came in insisting he had diagnosed himself online and refused to accept that he was wrong. And what happened next was one of the most extraordinary conversations I have had in 15 years of medicine." Victoria laughed. She let herself be in the room with her friend, with the wine and the food and the specific, irreplaceable comfort of being known by someone who had known you before you became anyone's wife. And she did not read the article about Daniel until the next morning. She read it at 7:15 with her coffee in both hands, sitting on the floor because she still hadn't properly furnished the apartment, and she didn't mind. The article from the Wall Street Journal was careful and fairly reported. It described the announcement that Daniel Hayes would be transitioning from his CEO role to an executive chairman position, while the company conducted an internal review of certain strategic decisions made in the past 18 months. The transition was framed as voluntary and forward-looking. The language was exactly what it was, corporate packaging around a forced step back that everyone in the industry would read correctly. Victoria read it twice. She thought about the Hayes dynamics she had watched Daniel build. The 11 people in the rented Midtown office. The years when they had both worked 16-hour days, him building the company, her building the foundation, and compared notes over dinner and believed completely that they were building something together, even if they were building it in parallel rather than in the same room. She thought he did build something real. Whatever else is true, he built something real. She set the phone down. She got up and made more coffee and started getting ready for work. Because the Whitmore Foundation had a board meeting at 9, and she had a presentation to give on the Meridian Partnership Framework, and Daniel Hayes was not the only person who had built something real. The board meeting lasted 2.5 hours. The 12 members of the Whitmore Foundation board sat around the conference table, and Victoria stood at the front of the room, no podium, no lectern. Just herself and a printed summary she had prepared, and she walked them through the proposed partnership with the Meridian Women's Leadership Fund. She was precise and organized, and she answered every question without hedging. And she had the specific experience of a woman who knows her material so thoroughly that she can hold the room without performing anything. The board voted unanimously to proceed. Afterward, the board chair, a woman named Carol Fontaine, who was 73 years old and had run a major publishing house for 20 years before her retirement, stopped Victoria near the door. She said, "That was the best presentation you've given in 5 years." Victoria said, "I'm not sure I agree with that assessment." Carol said, "I am. There's something different, not about the material. About you." She studied Victoria with the directness of a woman who had spent 50 years in rooms where directness was the only currency worth carrying. "You look like someone who stopped waiting for permission." Victoria held her gaze for a moment. "I suppose I did," she said. Carol nodded. She said, "It suits you, it always should have." Then she left, and Victoria stood in the empty conference room for a moment and thought about that. Stopped waiting for permission. She wasn't entirely sure what permission she had been waiting for, or from whom. But she recognized the accuracy of it, the way you recognize something that was always true but required exactly the right words to come clear. 11 days after moving into the furnished apartment, something happened that Victoria would later identify as the moment the new chapter became real rather than theoretical. She got a phone call at 8 in the morning from a woman named Dr. Lydia Park, who ran the graduate business program at Columbia University. Lydia was 42, sharp and direct and collegial, and she had a specific purpose. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it before you answer," Lydia said. "We have a gap in our spring curriculum. The course is called Leadership, Identity, and Institutional Change. It's a graduate seminar, 12 students maximum, meets twice weekly. The professor who was going to teach it had a family emergency and is taking the semester off." A brief pause. "I've been watching your foundation work for years, Victoria. The Newark Project, the Literacy Initiative, the way you build partnerships across sectors. And I've been thinking about you for this course for about 4 days." Victoria said, "I'm not an academic." "No," Lydia said. "That's precisely why I want you. These students have access to plenty of academics. What they don't have access to is someone who has actually built something, made decisions under real pressure, and navigated the intersection of personal identity and institutional leadership from the inside." Victoria was quiet. Lydia said, "I know the timing is complicated." "The timing," Victoria said, "is either terrible or perfect, and I can't tell which. Lydia said, in my experience, those are often the same thing. Victoria said, let me think about it. She thought about it for exactly 2 days. She said yes on a Thursday afternoon, and the moment she said it, she felt something shift in the architecture of what her days were going to look like, and the shift felt entirely right. She called her mother. Eleanor said, Columbia, graduate seminar. Spring semester, a pause. Are you nervous? Enormously, Victoria said. Good, Eleanor said. If you weren't nervous, it wouldn't be worth doing. The first time Daniel called after the settlement was signed was on a Wednesday, 3.5 weeks into November. Victoria saw his name and felt the now familiar response in her body, the slight acceleration of everything, followed immediately by the deliberate steadying, and she answered because avoiding him permanently was not something she intended to do. They had shared 22 years and a life that didn't disappear. It just became something you carried differently. I saw the news about the Columbia course, he said. She stopped. How did you see that? Lydia Park's assistant sent an announcement to her department mailing list. I'm on it from a guest lecture I gave 2 years ago. A pause. He stopped. What? She said. That's exactly right for you. That's exactly the thing you should be doing.
His voice had
the hollow, genuine quality of a man with no performance left in him. I've been thinking about you a lot lately, about the things I watched you do over 22 years, that I told myself I appreciated, and then didn't protect the way I should have. Victoria said, Daniel, I know, he said, I'm not calling to revisit anything. I just wanted to say that. She was quiet for a moment. How are you? She asked, and she meant it genuinely. Not as politeness, not as performance. She meant it the way you mean it about someone whose well-being is no longer your daily responsibility, but still matters in the way that things you once loved always matter. Managing, he said. And she recognized the word because it was the word she had used to her mother the morning after the gala. Managing, meaning getting through, meaning still standing. Meaning not yet okay, but working on it. Good, she said. That's enough for now. She ended the call. She sat with it for a while. Then she opened the Columbia course syllabus she had been building and went back to work. The week before Thanksgiving, Julian came to her new apartment for dinner. He brought wine and she cooked, which she had not done in a real way in years. The Riverside Drive apartment had a kitchen that had always felt like Daniel's domain, designed and outfitted to his preferences, used primarily for the dinner parties he liked to host. Her parents' kitchen was her mother's. This kitchen, small and adequate and entirely hers, was the first kitchen that had belonged to no one but Victoria, and she had been cooking in it with a specific and private pleasure since the day she moved in. She made her grandmother's recipe for short ribs, a 3-hour process involving wine and patience and the particular alchemy of heat and time that turned tough things tender, and Julian sat at the kitchen counter and talked while she worked, the way they had done in their parents' kitchen when they were teenagers, him at the counter and her at the stove and their mother somewhere nearby, and the whole house filled with the sound of a family that knew how to be in the same room. She said, the Meridian partnership is moving fast. Julian said, Morrison finalized the co-sponsorship agreement this afternoon. Sandra Okafor's team is organized. I'm impressed. I told you did. He turned his wine glass slowly. There's something else I want to tell you. I've been sitting on it for about a week and I've decided you need to know. Victoria did not look up from the stove. Then tell me. Daniel has been approached by a private equity firm about Hayes Dynamics. They're interested in a significant acquisition, potentially a full buyout if the terms are right. The step back from the CEO role was, I think, partly strategic positioning for that conversation. A cleaner handoff if the deal goes through. Victoria considered this. Who's the firm? She asked. Julian named it. It was a name she knew. A serious, well-resourced firm with a track record of buying companies in transition and stabilizing them through management restructuring. If the deal goes through, Victoria said slowly, what happens to the valuation? That depends on the terms. But the initial figures and Form 6 next would be valued at roughly twice its current public market cap. Victoria thought about this. She thought about Section 8 of her prenuptial agreement, which Morrison's had been meticulous about. The contributions she had made during the marriage. The valuation framework they had used in the settlement. The specific language around Hayes Dynamics assets. She said, Richard needs to know about this. Julian said, Richard already knows. He called me this morning. He believes there may be grounds to revisit the settlement valuation in light of this development. Because if the acquisition proceeds at the numbers being discussed, The settlement figure significantly underrepresents the actual value of the marital contribution. Victoria set down the wooden spoon. She turned around. She looked at her brother. How significantly, she said. Julian met her eyes, double, possibly more. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Victoria could hear the short ribs in the oven. She could hear traffic from the street below. She could hear her own breathing, which had gone very steady in the way that breathing goes steady. When the body understands something, the mind is still catching up to. She said, "That's not what I agreed to." Julian said carefully, "It's not what you agreed to based on the information available at the time." If there was a pending acquisition conversation that Daniel's attorneys were aware of when they negotiated the settlement, then it was material information that should have been disclosed, Victoria said. Yes, she turned back to the stove. She picked up the spoon. She stirred for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Call Morrison tonight." Julian already had his phone out. She said, "Julian." He looked up. "This is not about the money," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I wanted fair. I said fair from the beginning. If fair means revisiting the settlement because the terms were built on incomplete information, then that's what it means. But I am not doing this out of anger, and I'm not doing it to hurt him." Julian studied her for a long moment. He said, "I know. Do you, Vic? I've known you for 43 years. I know." He put the phone to his ear. "I'm calling Morrison because it's the right thing to do. And because you deserve what's actually fair, and because Daniel's attorneys knew something they should have disclosed and chose not to, which means this is on them, not on you." She nodded. She went back to cooking. Morrison moved fast. By Friday morning, he had confirmed that Hayes Dynamics acquisition conversations with the private equity firm had begun 8 weeks before the settlement was signed. He had confirmed that Daniel's lead attorney had been aware of these conversations during the negotiation period. He had confirmed that this information met the legal definition of material non-disclosure in the settlement framework. He called Victoria at 9:15 Friday morning. "We have grounds," he said. She said, "What happens now?" "I contact Brannick and Slate and present our findings. At that point they have two choices: agree to a revised settlement reflecting accurate valuation, or we proceed to litigation, which, given the disclosure issue, is a position they would find extremely uncomfortable." Victoria said, "Give them the option to do the right thing first." Morrison said, "I always do." Brannick and Slate called back in 3 hours. They agreed to a revised settlement conversation. The second negotiation took 4 days. It was considerably less cooperative than the first. Daniel's attorneys were working from a position of embarrassment now, which made them defensive in ways that slowed the process, but the outcome, when it came, was unambiguous. Morrison called on a Tuesday morning. He said, "Victoria, it's done." She was standing in the Columbia faculty building between a meeting with Lydia Park about the spring syllabus and a conversation with the department coordinator about room assignments. She was holding a cup of coffee and a stack of papers, and she was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where she was supposed to be. She said, "Tell me," he told her. The revised figure was more than she had expected even after Julian's initial estimate. It was, by any measure, the financial foundation of a genuinely independent life. It was not a number that made what had happened worth it. Nothing made that worth it, but it was a number that made it impossible for anyone ever to say that Victoria Whitmore had walked away with less than she deserved. She thanked Morrison. She put the phone in her pocket. She looked at the stack of papers, in her other hand the course syllabus. 12 graduate students, twice a week, beginning in January. Leadership, identity, and institutional change. She thought about the morning after the gala, sitting on the floor of her childhood bedroom in the dark, giving herself 40 minutes to grieve. She thought about her mother's hand. She thought about Augustus walking across a ballroom with the specific gravity of a man who has already decided what comes next. She thought about signing her name as Victoria Whitmore for the first time in 22 years, and feeling in the insensible act of that signature, something returned to her that she had not realized she had given away. She thought, "You started this month as someone's wife. You are ending it as yourself." She tucked the papers under her arm and walked toward her next meeting. Lydia Park was already there, at the small conference table, with 2 coffees and an expression of genuine professional energy that Victoria found, in this particular moment, almost unbearably welcome. "I've been thinking about the first session," Lydia said. "The framing question you want to open with. Have you decided?" Victoria sat down. She picked up the coffee. She said, I want to open with a question about identity under pressure. What holds when everything external shifts? What's left of a person when the structures they built themselves around are removed? She paused. I want to start there because I think that's the real subject of the course. Not leadership as a professional function. Leadership as a way of remaining yourself when the world is insisting you become something smaller. Lydia looked at her across the table. She said, that's exactly right. Victoria nodded. She opened her notebook. She began, and outside the window of that small conference room, on the 14th floor of a Columbia faculty building, November moved through the city in its cold and specific way, indifferent to everything that had happened and everything that was beginning, the way time always moves forward and forward and forward. But Victoria Whitmore was moving with it now, not behind it. Not in spite of it, with it, and that, it turned out, made all the difference. January arrived the way January always arrives in New York, without apology, without ceremony, with the specific cold that gets into everything and reminds you that the city does not accommodate sentimentality about seasons or about anything else. Victoria Whitmore woke on the first Monday of the new year at 6:15 in the morning, made coffee in her own kitchen, stood at her own window, and felt, for the first time in what seemed like a very long time, that the day in front of her belonged entirely to her. Not to a marriage, not to a role, not to the careful management of someone else's public image or someone else's emotional weather. To her, fully, cleanly, irreversibly to her, she drank her coffee. She got dressed, she went to work. The Whitmore Foundation offices were already active. When she arrived at 8, Patricia, at her desk, 2 program coordinators in the conference room reviewing the Newark Arts Center's January schedule, the particular productive hum of a place that knew what it was doing and why it was doing it. Victoria walked through it and felt the specific satisfaction of an institution that had been built correctly. Not quickly, not impressively, correctly. She had her first call with Sandra Okafor at 8:30. The Meridian Partnership had moved from framework to reality over the past 6 weeks with a speed that had surprised even Julian, who was not easily surprised by logistical efficiency. The co-sponsored initiative, which they had named, after considerable back and forth, the Meridian Whitmore Transition Fellowship, had received its first round of applications in December. 312 women had applied for 24 fellowship spots. The applications had come from 41 states. The youngest applicant was 43. The oldest was 71. Sandra said, I want to read you one of the applications. I've been thinking about it for a week, and I want you to hear it. Victoria said, go ahead, Sandra read. The application was from a 60-year-old woman in Cincinnati named Barbara, who had spent 31 years as the financial director of her husband's construction company, managing every aspect of the business's accounting and operations, and who had discovered 18 months ago that her husband had been signing documents in her name for a company loan she had never authorized. The divorce had taken 14 months. She was starting over with professional credentials that were entirely real, and a professional reputation that existed entirely in the context of a company that was no longer hers. She had written in the final paragraph of her application, I am not looking for sympathy. I am looking for a room full of people who understand that starting over at 60 is not a failure. It is an act of extraordinary courage, and I would like, for once, to be in a room where that is simply understood without requiring explanation. Victoria was quiet for a moment after Sandra finished reading. She said she's in. Sandra said she's in. They spent the next hour on logistics, the fellowship schedule, the mentor matching process, the financial literacy component that Sandra's team had developed and that Victoria's team had reviewed and strengthened. By the time the call ended, Victoria had four pages of notes and the specific energized from workings that on something that matters for reasons that are not abstract. Patricia knocked at 10:15. She said the Times called again. Victoria looked up. The Times had been calling, with varying degrees of persistence, since November. The journalist who had originally said comment, a woman named Ellen Marsh, who covered women's leadership and institutional power, had been professional and patient and had not resorted to the kind of pressure tactics that less scrupulous reporters used. She had called every 2 weeks, left a message, and waited. Victoria had said no every time. She thought about Barbara from Cincinnati. 312 applications from 41 states. Women who were starting over and did not want to be looked at with sympathy. Women who wanted to be in a room where courage was simply understood. She said, "Get Ellen Marsh's number. I'll call her back myself." Patricia's eyebrows performed their quarter-inch movement. "Are you sure?" Patricia said. "Yes," Victoria said. "But I'm calling her on my terms. I'm not talking about the gala. I'm not talking about Daniel. I'm talking about the fellowship." Patricia nodded. "I'll get the number." Victoria called Ellen Marsh at 11 that morning. Ellen answered on the second ring, which told Victoria she had been waiting. "Ms. Whitmore," Ellen said, "thank you for calling back. I want to be clear about what I'm willing to discuss and what I'm not," Victoria said, because clarity was the only foundation for a conversation like this one. "I'm not going to talk about my marriage. I'm not going to talk about the gala, or about Daniel, or about what was or wasn't said by anyone in that ballroom in October. That chapter is closed and it's going to stay closed." A brief pause, then Ellen said, "Understood. What I will talk about is the Meridian Whitmore Transition Fellowship. What it is, why it exists, what we're trying to do for the women who are part of it. If that's a story you're interested in, I'm available." Ellen said, "When can we meet?" They met the following Thursday at the Whitmore Foundation offices. Ellen was 41, precise and genuinely curious with the particular quality of a journalist who was interested in the real story rather than the accessible one. She asked good questions. She listened to the answers without reshaping them to fit a narrative she had already written. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Victoria talked about the fellowship, about Barbara from Cincinnati and the 293 other women whose applications she had read sitting at her kitchen table with coffee and the specific kind of grief-adjacent tenderness that comes from reading honest accounts of hard things. She talked about what the fellowship was designed to do, not rescue women, not fix them, not frame their experience as tragedy requiring intervention, but simply provide the resources and the room that Barbara had asked for. A room where starting over was understood as an act of courage. She talked about the Whitmore Foundation's 20 years of work, about the Newark Arts Center, about the literacy programs, about what it meant to build something that had your name on it, and to know, without ambiguity, that it existed because of you. She talked about her mother, about Eleanor's specific brand of absolute unperformative strength, about watching a woman navigate a 68-year life without ever once appearing to need anyone's approval for the way she was living it. She did not talk about Daniel. She did not talk about the gala. Ellen did not ask about either. At the end of the interview, as Ellen was closing her notebook, she said, "One thing. Off the record, if you prefer," Victoria said, asked, "the night of the gala, the way you sat there. I've watched the video 100 times. I know that sounds excessive, but I'm trying to understand something. You knew what was happening. You knew what she was doing when she took that microphone. And you just didn't react. How did you do that?" Victoria considered the question. She said, "I wasn't not reacting. I was reacting to the right thing instead of the obvious thing. The obvious reaction was the one she wanted. The right reaction was to remember who I was before she took that microphone and stay that person after she was done." Ellen looked at her. She said, "Can I use that?" Victoria said yes. The article ran 3 weeks later, on a Sunday in the Times Magazine section. It was long, 4,000 words, and it was, by any honest assessment, extraordinarily well done. Ellen had written it with the care of someone who understood that the real story was not the dramatic one, but the one underneath the drama. A woman rebuilding, not from catastrophe but from clarity. The specific and undervalued process of choosing yourself after years of choosing the wrong things. The headline was, "She didn't break, here's what she built instead." Victoria read it at her kitchen table at 7 in the morning, before her coffee was finished. She read it once through quickly and then again slowly, and then she set the phone down and sat with it. It was accurate. That was the thing that mattered most to her in the end. It was accurate. It told the truth about the fellowship and about the foundation and about the women the Meridian Whitmore Initiative was trying to reach. It told the truth about who she was and what she had spent 20 years building. It was not the story of a wronged wife. It was the story of a woman who had been many things and was now specifically and intentionally herself. She called her mother at 7:30. Eleanor said, "I read it." "And it's accurate," Eleanor said. Victoria smiled. "That's what I thought. Your father is going to call you in about 10 minutes. He read it at 5:30 and has been composing himself ever since." "Composing himself?" he cried. Eleanor said, "He's going to deny that, so I'm giving you advance notice." Augustus called at 7:42. He said, "I read the article. Victoria said, "I know, it's good work," he said. "The fellowship, what you're building." He paused. "I'm proud of you, not because of the article, because of the thing the article is about." She said, "Dad." He said, "Don't." She didn't. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Always." The article changed things in ways Victoria had anticipated and ways she had not. The anticipated changes, the fellowship received 400 additional inquiries within 48 hours of publication. Sandra Okafor called at noon on Sunday to report that the Meridian Fund's website had crashed twice from traffic volume. 3 other foundations reached out to ask about partnership possibilities. A literary agent called the Whitmore Foundation offices on Monday morning, asking whether Victoria had considered writing a book. Victoria told Patricia to note the literary agent's information and take no further action. She was not ready for a book. She was not sure she would ever be ready for a book. She was, for the time being, interested in doing the work. The unanticipated change arrived on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after the article ran, in the form of a phone call that Patricia transferred with an expression Victoria could not quite read. "It's a woman named Helen Marsh," Patricia said, "not Ellen Marsh the journalist. A different woman, Helen. She says she read the article and she has something she wants to tell you. She says it's personal." Victoria said, "Did she say what it was about?" Patricia said she said it was about Daniel. The room was very still for a moment. Victoria said, "Put her through." Helen Marsh was 64 years old. She had a voice that was steady and deliberate, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this call many times and was now simply executing it. She said, "I read the article about you and the fellowship, and I thought about calling for a week before I did. I want you to know that." Victoria said, "All right." Helen said, "I was married to a man named Gerald Marsh for 26 years. Gerald was a business partner of Daniel Hayes in the early years, before Hayes Dynamics was anything significant. They had a joint venture together about 23 years ago that didn't work out." She paused. When it didn't work out, Daniel structured the dissolution of the partnership in a way that left Gerald with almost nothing. Gerald spent 4 years fighting it legally and lost. "We lost our house in that process. We lost a significant amount of what we had built." Victoria sat very still. She said, "I didn't know about a partnership." "Before Hayes Dynamics, most people didn't," Helen said. "Daniel was very good at moving forward, at not looking back at the things he left behind." Another pause. "I'm not calling to ask you for anything. I'm not calling to hurt him further or to add to whatever is already happening to him. I'm calling because I read what you wrote about the fellowship, the women who are starting over, and I thought, that is what I needed 20 years ago. And I wanted you to know that what you're building is real, that it's necessary, that there are women who needed something like this long before you had the reason to create it." Victoria processed this. She thought about Gerald and Helen Marsh 20 years ago losing a house. She thought about Daniel moving forward with his characteristic speed and confidence, not looking back. She thought about how a person can be built from choices they think no one is counting, and how those choices accumulate into a character that eventually becomes impossible to maintain. She said, "Helen, would you be willing to share your story with us? Not publicly unless you wanted to, but with our fellowship cohort," in a silence. Then Helen said, "Yes, I think I would." Victoria said, "I'll have someone from our team reach out." She put the phone down. She sat at her desk for a long moment. She thought, 23 years ago, before Hayes Dynamics, before the 11 people in the rented Midtown office, before everything Daniel had built and everything he had destroyed in the building. She thought, you never fully know a person. Not really. You know the version of them they bring to the rooms you share. And the rooms you don't share contain entire other versions, entire other histories, entire other people who carry the marks of decisions you were never told about. She did not call Julian. She did not call Morrison. She wrote Helen Marsh's contact information in her notebook, and then she opened the Newark Arts Center file and she went back to work. Because the work was where she lived now, and it was exactly where she intended to stay. The Columbia seminar began on a Thursday in the 3rd week of January. 12 graduate students. A classroom that was slightly too warm in the way that university buildings are always slightly too warm. Victoria stood at the front of the room at 6 in the evening and looked at 12 people who were at various stages of becoming whoever they were going to be. And she felt something she had not expected to feel, entirely calm. Not the composed, managed calm of the gala. Not the deliberately constructed stillness of a woman maintaining her dignity under pressure. Simple, genuine calm, the calm of being exactly in the right place. She said, "Before we talk about anything on the syllabus, I want to ask you a question. And I want you to sit with it for a moment before you answer." She paused. When everything external is removed, the title, the role, the relationship, the institution, the reputation, what is left of a person? What is the thing that doesn't change when everything around it does? The room was quiet. A young woman in the second row, 24, with the focused expression of someone who had already learned to take ideas seriously, raised her hand and said, "The decisions they make when no one is watching." Victoria looked at her. She said, "Say more." The young woman said, "I think who you actually are is the person you are in the moments that aren't being performed. When there's no audience and no stake and no one to impress. That's the self that's real. And everything else is construction." Victoria nodded slowly. She thought about a ballroom. 600 people. A microphone seized from an MC's hand and turned into a weapon. And herself, sitting in her chair, not performing composure but genuinely possessing it, because the self she had built over 47 years was not a construction. It was not borrowed from a marriage or a role or another person's approval. It was hers. She said, "That's exactly right." And the question this course is going to keep asking is, how do you build that self deliberately? How do you become someone whose foundation doesn't require external validation to hold? The class responded. They argued and questioned and pushed back and asked things she hadn't anticipated and said things that were genuinely insightful and said things that were genuinely wrong, and she corrected them without diminishing them and pushed them without losing them. And by the time the 2 hours finished, she walked out of that building feeling more alive than she had felt in years. She called Margot on the way home. Margot said, "How was it?" Victoria said, "It was the best 2 hours I've had in a very long time." Margot said, "Better than the whiskey night." Victoria said, "Different. More forward-facing." Margot said, "Forward-facing. I like that." On the last Friday of January, something happened that closed a loop Victoria had not realized was still open. She was leaving the Whitmore Foundation offices at 6 in the evening, coat on, bag over her shoulder, thinking about the short ribs she had decided to make again this weekend because they had turned out well and the repetition of good things was underrated. She stepped out onto the sidewalk into the specific cold of a January evening, and she saw Daniel Hayes standing 20 feet away. He was not waiting for her. She could tell immediately that he had not planned. He was coming from the direction of Park Avenue, clearly on his way somewhere else, and he saw her at exactly the same moment she saw him, and both of them stopped. They stood on the sidewalk in the early dark of a January evening and looked at each other for a moment. He looked different, not worse. Exactly. Changed. The particular compressed confidence that had always been his most immediately visible quality had softened into something more ordinary, and ordinary on Daniel Hayes looked unexpectedly human. He was wearing a good coat, and he looked tired in a way that sleep could not fix, the tired of a man who has spent months sitting with consequences. He said, "Victoria," she said, "Daniel." A pause that contained approximately 2 decades of weather. He said, "I saw the article." "I know," she said. "It's been a week." He said, "The fellowship. What you're building." He looked at her with an expression that was difficult to categorize, grief and admiration, and something that might have been a specific kind of regret, the kind that knows it has no practical application, but exists anyway. "It's exactly what you should be doing. It always was." She said, "Yes, it is." He nodded. He looked at the sidewalk for a moment. He said, "I'm sorry. I know I've said it. I know it doesn't. I know it's not enough. But I'm going to keep saying it because it's the true thing, and it's the only thing I have left to offer." She looked at him. She said, "I know you're sorry, Daniel. I believe that you are. And I have spent a lot of the last 3 months deciding how to carry that and where to put it and what to do with it. And what I've decided is that your regret is yours to live with. I'm not going to spend my life helping you manage it." She paused. "But I also don't wish you badly. I want to be honest about that too. We spent 22 years together. That was real, even when other things weren't. And I hope you figure out how to be someone you can be proud of." "I genuinely do." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You're a remarkable person, Victoria." She said, "I know." She said it simply, without vanity, without performance, as a statement of fact. Because she did know, now in the specific and unshakable way that you know things when you have stopped for external confirmation of them. She knew who she was. She knew what she was building. She knew what she was worth. She said, "Take care of yourself." She walked past him. She did not look back. 6 blocks later, she called her mother. Eleanor answered immediately. Victoria said, "I just ran into Daniel on the street." A beat of silence. "Then are you all right?" Victoria thought about it. She said, "Yes, actually yes, not managing, not getting through it. Actually yes." Eleanor was quiet for a moment in the specific way that contained a great deal of feeling being held with great care. She said, "Good, come for dinner Sunday." Victoria said, "I'll bring the wine." The first cohort of the Meridian Whitmore Transition Fellowship met for the first time on a Saturday morning in February. 24 women, 43 to 71 years old, from 31 different states. With 31 different versions of the same core experience, the moment when the structure of their lives had shifted underneath them, and they had to decide what they were made of when the scaffolding was gone. Victoria stood at the front of the room and looked at them. She thought about Barbara from Cincinnati. She had found her immediately in the group, a sturdy, clear-eyed woman in the second row, who was looking back at Victoria with the specific expression of someone who is in the right place and knows it, and is trying not to show how much that matters. Victoria said, "I'm not going to tell you that this is going to be easy. You know it's not. You wouldn't be here if it were easy. What I am going to tell you is that this room exists because a lot of people who came before you figured out that the hardest part of rebuilding is not the practical work. It's the moment when you decide that you are worth rebuilding for." The room was very quiet. She said, "That decision is the beginning of everything. And most of you made it before you walked in this door. You made it when you filled out the application. You made it when you got on the plane or drove through the night, or arranged care for someone who depends on you so that you could be here." She looked at them. "You've already done the hardest thing. The rest of this is just the work." Barbara from Cincinnati was looking at her with an expression that Victoria would remember for the rest of her life. It was the expression of a woman who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told by someone who has also carried it that she can set it down. Victoria said, "So, let's get to work," and they did. The months that followed were not easy. They were not uncomplicated or unmarked by difficulty or free from the specific pain of a life in transition. Some days Victoria sat at her desk and felt the absence of 22 years the way you feel a missing tooth constantly, involuntarily, with a tongue that could not stop finding the gap. Some days the anger arrived without warning, bright and sharp and real, and she let herself feel it for exactly as long as was necessary, and then she set it down. Some days she was simply tired, but she had the foundation. She had the fellowship. She had 12 graduate students twice a week who argued with her and pushed her and said things that were so genuinely smart they made her feel, at 57, that she was still learning. She had Sandra Okafor, who called on Thursdays to compare notes on the fellowship, and who had become, over 6 months, a friend of the specific kind that arrives late in life and is worth more than anyone expects. She had Margot, who answered on the second ring and brought Vietnamese food and told the truth. She had Julian, who was building a case against time itself with his characteristic efficiency and who called every few days with information she needed and occasionally information she didn't, but that he was going to share anyway. She had her parents, dinner on Sundays, her father's wine in her mother's hand, and the particular warmth of a family that had chosen, without deliberation, to simply show up. She had her name, Victoria Whitmore, the name she was born with, the name she had given up, the name she had taken back in a single line of a settlement agreement on a Tuesday afternoon in November, the name she had signed on the first page of the Meridian Partnership documents and on every letter she had written since,
and on the byline of the article in the Times, and on the fellowship enrollment forms, and on the door of the office she had been
given at Columbia for the duration of the spring semester. Victoria Whitmore, 47 years old, founder of the Meridian Whitmore Transition Fellowship, visiting instructor, Columbia University, executive director, the Whitmore Foundation, daughter of Augustus and Eleanor, sister of Julian, friend of Margot, woman who had sat in a ballroom in October and not broken, not because she was performing strength, but because the strength was real, and it had always been real, and the only thing the events of that evening had done was make it visible. On the last Sunday of April, she went to her parents' house for dinner. It was warm enough to eat on the terrace, which they did. The 4 of them, with the good wine and the particular ease of a family that has been through something together and is on the other side of it and knows it. Augustus grilled, which he did with the focused satisfaction of a man who believed in doing ordinary things well. Eleanor arranged flowers from the market, which she did every Sunday and had done every Sunday for 40 years, and which produced, every week, something genuinely beautiful. Julian was on his phone for the first 15 minutes and then put it away when Augustus looked at him, which was the same transaction that had been occurring between them since Julian was 14. Victoria sat on the terrace and drank her wine and felt the April air on her face and thought about nothing in particular. Just the warmth, just the wine. Just the sound of her family moving around her in the specific and unremarkable way that families move when they are simply being together. Her father came and sat beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You doing okay, Vicky?" She smiled. He had called her Vicky since she was 4 years old. He was the only person in the world who did. She said, "Yeah, Dad, I'm doing really okay." He nodded. He looked out across the terrace. He said, "I want to tell you something. I've been trying to find the right time." He paused. "That night at the gala, when I walked in and saw you sitting there, you know what I saw?" She looked at him. He said, "I saw my daughter. Not Daniel's wife, not the woman who had just been publicly humiliated. My daughter. Sitting with her back straight, and her hands in her lap and her face completely calm, and I thought she is going to be exactly fine. Not eventually. Right now, she is already fine." He looked at her. And I was right. She felt her throat tighten. She said, "You always think you're right." He said, "I usually am." She laughed. She leaned her head briefly against her father's shoulder, the way she had done since she was small. The way some gestures survive of intense life because they are too essential to lose. He put his arm around her for a moment. Then Eleanor called from inside that dinner was ready, and Augustus stood, and Victoria stood, and they went inside together. And the evening was warm and ordinary and entirely, completely enough. Victoria Whitmore had walked into a ballroom in October as someone's wife and walked out as herself. She had signed her name back into existence on a Tuesday afternoon in November. She had built something that 312 women had found their way to before February. She had stood at the front of a university classroom and asked the right questions and gotten answers that surprised her. She had sat across from a young woman in a dark coat who needed to apologize and let the apology be enough. She had run into her ex-husband on a sidewalk in January and wished him well and meant it and walked away without looking back. She had grieved, she had worked. She had laughed with Margot on the floor of an unfurnished apartment. She had cooked short ribs in her own kitchen for her brother and felt in the smell of wine and patience and heat that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had not broken, not because breaking was beneath her, not because she was too strong to feel pain, but because she had spent 47 years building a self that was not contingent on anyone else's choices, and when the choice was made for her, that self remained. Intact and clear and entirely her own, that was the real story. Not the gala, not the red dress, not the microphone or the pointed finger or the champagne glass raised in mockery. Those were the events. The story was what had always been underneath them, a woman who knew who she was and who, when the world tried very hard to make her forget it, simply did not. Victoria Whitmore knew who she was and she was not finished yet.